All right, guys, welcome back to the show. Today I have Leo Gabriel on. He owns a company, an engineering firm called Revival Engineering. They're based out of Boston. He also does some work out of Colorado as well. And in today's episode, what we're going to be trying to cover is essentially the cost of going green here in Massachusetts and kind of what that entails. He has a unique perspective because he is an engineer and he understands the materials, what it takes to build in terms of the permitting, so on and so forth. So welcome, Leo.
Thank you. Glad to be on here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. So just for a quick intro, how long have you been an engineer?
How long I've been an engineer? I mean, if you include internships, if you include all that experience, over a decade.
Over a decade?
Yes.
I gotcha. And when did you move to Massachusetts?
About 5 years ago.
5 years ago? You like it here?
Love it here.
Yeah?
Yeah. Wouldn't trade it for the world. Yep.
I gotcha.
Great.
We like it too, but as we know and I talk about a lot, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes, and that's why, I brought you in today. So and I do have some questions I saved from that you have not seen yet from some of our subscribers. So we're going to hammer those out probably midway through, give or take. We'll see how this goes, okay? But the first thing I want to ask is really from your perspective, an engineer's perspective, right? What are the biggest constraints that you see that Massachusetts faces in reducing energy costs?
Really what you're seeing is it's becoming much harder to build things. Permitting process takes forever. What used to take a few weeks now takes a few months, if not more than a year. I mean, you're talking putting a transformer vault for a 4 to 6 unit building. Mm-hmm. Normally you would feed tons of those from just one little transformer. It's all these codes. There's more inspections, and you've got inspectors that are often missing a lot of the big things, a lot of the older things.
Sure.
Really focused more on the green stuff. And it really should be focused on making sure meeting building codes, making sure meeting electrical codes.
Gotcha. And then in terms of when this started, so you've been doing this for 5 years here. Have you seen a lot of changes over the last 5 years?
Specifically with the recent codes, yes. With the electric mandates, I wouldn't call them mandates, but it's basic. It's not a mandate, but it's a mandate in terms of if you don't electrify, you have to have future provisions for electrification. And it's made, like I've mentioned, it's made projects much more expensive.
Sure.
And it's made permitting take a whole lot longer.
And then in terms of those mandates, if you want to call them that, so you're saying even if you build something that's new, it still needs to be essentially retrofitted, right? For, let's say, if they want electrification of this specific building, this unit, whatever it is, you still have to add that, even though the either homeowner or commercial business or whatever it is may not even use it. Is that correct?
Correct. And you need to size the load for the entire building with the assumption that one day you will connect all electric. And that is the case with basically all jurisdictions in Massachusetts that are using either the stretch or the specialized code. There's a few, I think Danvers is one of them, for example, that still use the baseline code where you don't have to do that.
Yeah.
But by far most of jurisdictions, especially in and around the Boston area, have fully adopted the specialized and stretch codes. Correct.
Do they provide, let me ask you this, do they provide any incentives or grants or, what I'm trying to ask, I guess, is does the state or the town or anybody get involved because they're effectively, forcing whoever's building this to implement what they want in terms of, let's say trying to make this a greener project, right? That's
Absolutely.
Essentially what it is. Do they provide any funds for that, or is that all on the developer?
Well, there's incentives, but when it comes down to providing funds for, let's say, bigger electrical gear, all these other extra construction costs, there's not that I'm aware of, there's no provision, there's no funds for that. There's
really?
Rebates for things like heat pumps.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure. I know there used to be tax credits for EV vehicles. I don't know if that. I'm not too familiar with that. Yeah. I'm more familiar on the engineering side. I don't know as far as if those tax credits are still present.
Gotcha.
I know with solar it was the same thing, but now it doesn't matter whether you want to put it or not. You have to have some roof space for future solar. You have to have 25% of your cars.
Yeah.
25% parking spaces have to be EV ready.
Really?
Yes.
Does it depend on the size of the unit, or like the, let's say, like the size of whatever you're building, or however many, like it probably gets substantially harder depending on how many units you're building, right? The bigger the project, the more expensive it's going to be.
Of course, absolutely. And then if you've got bigger projects, specifically bigger commercial projects, you're talking sometimes as many as 75% of the parking spaces have to be EV ready, and 25% have to be EV already connected when the building opens
So they
for
already
business.
have to have EV stations there, just if they were to build it. Otherwise, it's not going to pass, right?
The 25 75. That applies for larger buildings. The numbers I don't have off the top of my head.
Yeah, of course.
But it's for most projects that we do, or the medium small size projects, it's just 25%.
Gotcha.
But for some of those larger projects, larger developments, there's that 25-75 rule.
Wow. So
Yes.
let me ask you this question. I'm going to speed ahead a little bit, and then we'll work our way back. So you still are doing engineering projects, and your firm is doing engineering projects in Colorado, correct?
Correct.
Do they have this in Colorado?
Denver does. Boulder, Colorado does. Most of the surrounding areas, not as much.
Not as much.
Not as
Is
much.
it as strict, or is it as, I feel as though Massachusetts is trying to be a leader in the regards of like going green, so on and so forth. Are what their mandates are in Colorado, are they as strict as here in Massachusetts?
In terms of things like HERS rating, which, it's determining how energy efficient a building or how net zero a building is, that they haven't gotten to that point yet, no.
They haven't gotten that far.
No, not
So you would say it's cheaper to do it or build, I should say, in Colorado versus here. Let's say cost aside, material, labor, so on and so forth. But just in terms of forcing you to do things, it's substantially cheaper in Colorado?
Unquestionably, yeah. Unquestionably, yeah. That's
Yeah. Are you familiar with other states as well, or are you just mainly...
Well, we do projects all across the country. We're licensed in about 40 states.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, especially when you're doing things like dental offices. If you're doing projects, a lot of these restaurant chains, they franchise all across the country, so you have to be familiar with
Yeah, you got to be familiar with all the code.
Correct. So
It was out of the states you've worked in, which is the hardest?
which is the hardest work? I would say...
In regards to what we're talking about.
I would probably say New York. The thing is, Mass, I would probably say Mass is definitely up there. It's probably...
Top 5?
Top 5. The thing is, for us, we're just used to it now. So
Sure.
it's the...
And you live here,
familiarity
right?
bias can play a role there. But yeah, exactly. We live here. We know what's expected. We kind of even know many of the building inspectors what they want to see. So
Sure.
it's harder to know exactly like what a newcomer or what someone who hasn't worked with Massachusetts. But I would say in terms of the requirements, in terms of how difficult it is to build a project.
All right, guys, if you're interested in supporting this podcast, please head over to themikeurbanshow.com, click on merch, and we have a whole bunch of new merch available. A lot of this is based on our thumbnails that we do. Of course, we have the Sun Denier shirt, which is a internal meme in our Discord channel. And if you're not already in our Discord channel, consider coming in there because we share a lot of topics that we are going to talk about, and people submit multiple things there, including you get to talk to me, ask me questions, so on and so forth. So again, head over to themikeurbanshow.com, click on merch, and you will be brought to this page. Thanks again. Let's ask you this question. How do Massachusetts energy codes affect MEP systems and the designs for both new and existing buildings?
Well, they basically create a system where you've got a grid that unfortunately can't handle all these EV mandates. What happens is you take, let's like an example I used earlier, like a 6-unit building that normally would be connected with maybe 200 amps of service.
Sure.
When you would have gas, and these are service size that are assuming you're talking halogen lights. They're not even assuming LED lights.
Right.
So you're talking having to put transformer vaults, really big, expensive supply chain rendered gear for those types of buildings. And I know I'm sure we'll touch more about this later in the podcast, but if you're talking about mechanical systems, obviously you're going all electrical there. When you're taking away gas heat, you're also putting these buildings at a lot more risk of system failure and all these other issues, especially when it comes to the frigid conditions.
Right.
So,
yeah. And you would say probably, we talked about heat pumps a little bit. As you know, or you may know, I was an electrician for 10 years. I don't know if you knew that or not, but...
I was for one, so you got me beat there.
Yeah, okay. So, every single time, and obviously now I'm in real estate, so I have clients that won't even look at a property if it does not have any sort of fossil fuel available. They will not even tour the property if it just is on electric heat. And I think that, and maybe you would agree with me on this, but I think that I'm sure parts of the country, since you work in so many different parts of the country, there may be, let's say, there may be a way where heat pumps are actually effective, right? So if you go closer to, the middle of the country or a little bit more south and you're not using it as much, it's efficient. But somewhere here, like in New England, where you could have, in the negatives for wind chill and so on and so forth, it puts a lot of strain on those heat pumps. So I'm just going to ask you, in terms of heat pumps in general, in New England, do you see that being a positive or a negative?
Well, heat pumps, that's a big rabbit hole. So
I know.
I gotta say, when it comes to cooling, on the cooling side, heat pumps are amazing. They are the LED light of the HVAC industry. They are very efficient. They cool very efficiently, using a whole lot less power than traditional AC sources. So for cooling, I would use them anytime, any place.
And that's like a split unit you would see, right? Like on your, something like that, with the condenser outside, so on and so forth.
For those who don't know what a heat pump is,
Yes.
So, correct. But what a heat pump does is it does both heating and cooling, which first of all means it's going to need more maintenance because it's on basically the entire year.
Right.
Which, I mean, you could weigh that depending on, if you have a boiler and an AC unit, well, they're going to meet to be serviced half the time, but you've got two different services. So,
sure.
I mean, that balances out. But when it comes to heating, the colder it gets, the harder those heat pumps have to work. Because the heat pump, the way it works, and for the viewers that don't know what a heat pump is and where the technology differs, is it literally pumps heat from one place to another. When you're trying to cool a space, what you're doing is you're pumping heat away from the space outdoors to cool a space. When you're trying to heat a space, you're pumping heat from the outside into the space. So you're pumping
it's
heat
working
rather than
in reverse, essentially.
Exactly. But when you're talking really frigid temperatures, there's less and less heat to pump, and those units have to work extra hard, to the point where they become really inefficient. And at really cold temperatures, they really don't work at all frantically. You need some supplemental baseboard or electric heat.
Yes.
Things like that. Like, why do you think folks in Canada and Siberia don't use heat pumps? Exactly. Like they need some kind of gas at very least for a backup.
Do you ever see the future of these heat pumps? Like, obviously the technology on the heating side is rather new. The reason I know that is because 10 years ago, or not even 10 years, 15 years ago, they used to make the split units and they were only air conditioning, right?
Yep.
And then they started rolling out where they did have a heat pump, and then it could heat like to a certain degree, like it can't go below 36 degrees or something like that.
Exactly.
So the technology on the cooling side is relatively good, but the technology perhaps on the heating side is not that efficient, right? So do you think that it'll ever catch up? Like, is there an opportunity for that to catch up, or is let's say the elements here, is that too much of a strain on the heating system?
Well, I mean, from a physics perspective, you are fighting physics. When there's less when there's less cold air to pump, there's less heat that you can pump from that cold air. But then again, I can't say what if, the future is really unknown, and there's really so much we don't know that we don't know, kind of a thing. So I mean, let's see what future engineers can come up with. But as things stand now, like I said, they're great for cooling. On the heating side, they're problematic in terms of they eat a lot more power than traditional AC units, and obviously they eat more power than a gas unit that just needs an ignition. Right.
And then in terms of the savings, you're not essentially going to save that much. Like, you'll save on the AC side, right? Yes. Because they're very efficient. But then on the back end, if you have to, at least here in New England, if you have to heat your home and your sole source of heating is a heat pump, you may be in trouble because we don't have the math in front of us, of course, but you may be at a net zero whether you're saving or gaining anything, right? Like, based on the load during winter.
Absolutely, and especially as the utility prices and the price of electricity goes up. Things like duct heaters, unit heaters, baseboard heaters, all this electric heat is much more expensive than gas heat. Gotcha.
So in terms of the buildings, both commercial and residential, are they making the developers do they have to use electricity for the buildings? Like, do they have to put heat pumps in? Is it required?
Well, you have to meet what's called a HERS rating. So I'm not a HERS rater.
Sure.
I work with HERS raters for my projects, though, but you have to get a certain amount of points to make sure that your building qualifies under certain codes. Mm-hmm. That's what you have to do. And I'd consult a HERS rater about that. And that's why I say it's an it's not an EV mandate, but it's an EV mandate in terms of if you went all fossil fuels, it would be very, very difficult to find a way to get enough HERS points to for a new building to meet code.
I gotcha. Okay. So, and the other question I wanted to ask, just in regards to the heat pumps, is in the wintertime, are newer units, so I have a unit in one of the buildings that I own, and during the winter months, sometimes what will happen is it'll go into DF mode, which is, I guess, defrost, right?
Yeah.
Does that still happen on a lot of units? Do they still have to do that?
Well, they've gotten better, and it also depends. Another thing is, I don't want a university to give one size fits all recommendations for
Sure.
projects. Insulation is, and then this plays a key role in energy codes too, but insulation also matters too, like how well your building is insulated.
Right.
Is also how effective a heat pump is. But yeah, defrosting is still an issue. And you see that, just like you see with EV cars, like, they've got batteries.
Yes.
Sometimes you're plugging in a car overnight, the battery doesn't charge at all. You just plug the car in just to keep the battery warm. You've used all that power
Right.
just to keep it warm.
Right,
so that's
right.
another issue.
The another question for you. So, in terms of the costs involved, and obviously we don't have data, we don't have spreadsheets in front of us, stuff like that.
Right.
Because you work in so many different markets, like, I'm not going to have you pin a percentage or number on this, but in order to get the projects that you're doing here in Massachusetts, let's say up to this HERS rating and, being retrofitted for future electricity goals or, these net zero carbon goals, how much you could just, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, of course, but like how much does that add to a project?
In terms of
cost, yes.
Oh, it adds to cost in many ways. I would say it can easily more than double the utility cost. Like, think about it this way. Like, if you, instead of a 200 amp service, if you're putting a 600 amp service and you got to put a transformer vault, you got to pour that vault, you got to get all the permitting, and then there's also the time too.
Yeah.
You've got supply chain issues, and now I know we've got tariffs possibly going on. Like,
Sure.
so many, and with bigger gear, you're paying a lot more. So just from the electrical side, my primary trade is electrician, electrical engineer.
Yeah.
You're paying more than double, triple.
Really?
Costs to yes.
And that's just on the electrical side.
That's just exactly. Now, when it comes to an outlet is still an outlet. So when it
Of
comes
course.
but when it comes to providing a service for a building, you're talking a lot. Much
Do you
more
think
cost.
this is sustainable? Like, in terms of people being able, like, I guess let me back up. Let me ask this question. Do you think that because of, these mandates that the state is imposing on developers and builders and so on and so forth, do you think it's limiting the amount of new construction because of the cost?
Well, it unquestionably is. If you make it more expensive to build something, it's less stuff is going to be built. You're going to need more money to finance even the smallest projects.
Right. Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah.
Do you think that these mandates may ever, like, do you ever think that they may backtrack on some of this stuff? Is it a possibility?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, first of all, like, you think about what is the consequence of not getting something built? What's the consequence of having such strict mandates that you're not putting new buildings up and you're keeping the old ones up because they're grandfathered in, even though
Right.
just making slight changes, even changing an oil boiler to a natural gas boiler
Yeah.
would create tremendous energy savings. It would lower carbon emissions, but because we don't let you do that, some people will keep their oil boiler.
Right.
I'm just using an example, but
Sure, of course.
there's also that hidden cost where I don't think any of these, I don't think any of the code reviewers, I don't think a lot of the folks that are making the laws, I don't think they really think about that very much of what it's like to not have a product on the market or
Yes.
have people afraid to make small changes because they feel like they have to change the whole thing.
Right.
They do make an upgrade, for example.
Yes.
So that's, I think, a really big cost that no one's talking about.
So what you're talking about is like the permitting side, right? Like,
Yes.
let's say you want to switch over an old oil boiler to something else. They're concerned about two things, really, right? Number one, what is the cost of the permitting going to be? And number two, they don't even necessarily know what they could it's going to come to a point where they don't even know what they could install, right?
They might get halfway through construction that they'll say, okay, you change this, you have to change the whole thing now.
Wow. That's crazy.
And then it leads to people. I mean, I've seen people, they do stuff out, which is where you don't want to go, is you see people doing stuff without a permit.
Yes.
Without getting it reviewed just because they don't want to change their entire building.
Right.
Which that's not what Boston needs. That's not what Mass needs.
Right. Yeah, it's like a double negative because you're in a position where, they're trying to, and I understand this, right? Like, fossil fuels may not be infinite, right? They may not be infinite, right? I'm not an expert on that. I'm assuming they may not be infinite.
Right.
Where, if we use like wind and solar, obviously they're more readily available depending on what part of the country, but they're not as reliable, right? In term. So, so kind of what we talked about there was that all of these codes, all of these mandates, all of these regulations, they're essentially putting a bottleneck on new development, right? And they're also putting a bottleneck on, let's say, redevelopment of older buildings.
Oh, yeah.
So they may be, in one hand, they may be, trying to, or at least attempting to do the right thing, or what they perceive as the right thing. But on the other hand, you're also limiting people, right? Especially in terms of new buildings and new construction and renovations.
Absolutely. And I see this all the time. And I see buildings like they've got an existing 200 amp service. They got maybe an existing 1-inch gas line. And I'm just throwing in some numbers out there.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, all this needs to change. And now you need to put this big transformer ball, then you need to put all this services in. And what I'm telling people, it doesn't have to be this way. It really does not have to be this way. If we just use heat pumps for cooling. If anything, old buildings should be taking more power than new buildings, because if you think about LED lights,
sure, of course,
LED lights and heat pumps use tremendously less energy than the traditional halogen lights did than old AC units. So if anything, the electrical service size of these buildings with technological innovations should be going down.
Right. And but the thing is, the cost is outweighing the gains on the back end.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
The front end costs, like you may not live long enough to see the benefits of the back end, right?
Absolutely.
It's crazy. It's really when you think about it. Let me ask you this. So obviously, being an engineer, I'm in real estate. I consult with other realtors, ask questions. I mean, have you talked to anybody else in your field just in regards to what happens here in Massachusetts? Like, have you ever talked to another engineer that's perhaps not from the area, or a past colleague, or somebody you went to college with, and talk about these things?
Well, I will tell you, colleagues that don't work in Mass that do projects here, they do get they definitely get a good talk back from a lot of the inspectors. Like, nope, you have to put EV here. Well, why? I just want to put gas. I'm just changing this here. Nope, that means you got to put this in and that in. And
so they come here for a one and done project, probably, right?
Yeah, if you're doing a project in Mass, just like if you're doing a project in like New York City, there's certain places where engineers from outside those areas know, like, if I'm doing a project here, like,
I gotcha.
Yeah, we need to bring in a local specialist or somebody. Like California has their Title 24, I think it is.
Yeah.
So there's some jurisdictions that you work in, Mass being one of them, that that you're in for not the usual rodeo.
It's not going to be a smooth process to get from point A to point B, right?
So,
and then what's your, like, I know that you I really want your opinion on this. So I talk a lot about the cost of our power, right? The cost of our electric bills, cost of our gas bills, so on and so forth. I mean, realistically, and I know we can't predict the future here, but realistically, at least to me, it seems like this is almost like an experiment. Like, we're like an experiment here, and the technology hasn't caught up. Like, the cost hasn't caught up with the perceived gains on the back end. And obviously, there's got to be a starting point where you try to implement these things. If you want to try to implement them, I understand that. But overall, I mean, Massachusetts is really not energy independent. They're energy dependent, right? So in terms of, people's costs of their electric bills and stuff like that, why do you think they're so high? What do you think is attributing to these things?
Well, it's unquestionably because you've got these anti-fossil fuel mandates, and then here's the thing: you're pushing things like this on people. You don't have to push, at least not anymore, LED lights on people, because they know they're going to save a lot of money. They know it's energy efficient. People want to use LED lights.
Sure.
You're pushing all these things, as you mentioned, the technology is not quite there. If the technology was there and it was clearly a cost saving and it was clearly substantially better for your health, the environment, I think the market would respond. And I really think that we do need to give let the market respond a little bit more than we're letting it, rather than pushing EV mandates. I mean, we've got many times in history where we would push a certain type of building style or a certain code, and then
it doesn't work out.
Exactly, and then a building looks a certain way. You're like, oh, this building was clearly built in the 80s when they were obsessed with this, or this was clearly built in the 70s when they were obsessed with that. Yeah, and it becomes just a temporary thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you think that since the technology hasn't caught up, that perhaps you think they should have waited before they started to implement? Like, what would you have done differently, right? If you were, if let's say you were doing this, right, and you had a decision to make, and you had the opportunity to either try to get this net zero carbon or whatever they're trying to do, and being an engineer, where the technology is at. do you think, and I'm not trying to put you on the hot seat here, of course, but do you think that you would have pushed as far as they're trying to push right now without necessarily knowing some of the, like, they know the upfront cost, but they don't know the back end savings, right? So would you have done anything differently?
Well, look, I can't speak for everyone in Massachusetts. I can't solve all our energy problems in this podcast. But,
right, of course.
So, I mean, I would really let the market respond to that. I mean, another issue is, I know that another thing you'd like to talk about is rebates.
Sure.
When you're giving rebates, whether it's for an electric car, whether it's for a heat pump, those rebates are paid by primarily people who can afford those rebates. It's in some ways a tax incentive for the wealthier. In terms of people who are just trying to get going, it makes energy cost a lot more expensive. And it means, like, okay, let's say they can't afford to electrify their entire house. They can't afford an electric car, but maybe they can afford to change their oil boiler to a gas boiler. So that's, and we're going a little, we're going a little bit back in circles here, but I'm just trying to say that's one of the issues with these mandates is, like I say, we're not encouraging people to make small positive changes, because ultimately it's not about we should go all electric and make that the thing of the decade, of the century, whatever you want. I think we should really just encourage people to make positive changes, which I think will both help them with their cost of living, as well as the environment, carbon emissions, energy efficiency, and making sure that we're exporting energy, not just importing energy,
right, as
we are here.
Do you think we'll ever come to that point, like in the United States, where we'll be able to export energy?
Well, it's the fracking and natural gas revolution has definitely put us close to that point. And when you talk about natural gas, they want to ban all fossil fuels, ideally in the States. When I say ban, I mean at least make it basically so it's unsustainable to meet code while using fossil fuels. But natural gas, just by having 1/3 of the emissions that coal has, for example, has made America cut so much in terms of carbon emissions. So I would hit the brakes a little bit on demonizing a source of energy that actually has led to carbon emissions being lowered quite a bit. And really try to find a solution that's more focused on small changes, and that allows people to make those positive changes without having to go big or go home.
Right, because these changes weren't like incremental, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you've been here for 5 years, right? It was just like somebody turning the light switch on, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, they gave you a warning that on this date the code is going to start applying, but it's not. But it just happened like that. And I don't think that's the best way. That's the best energy policy.
Yeah, because of course, like we talked about, it does limit new projects being built. It limits new opportunities. It limits companies coming into the state and doing what they need to do and providing jobs for people.
Exactly.
So like when you really think about it, like what are you trying to save? Because then on top of that, if I'm not mistaken, most of our electricity is generated by fossil fuels right now, right?
When you're plugging that car in, yes, Massachusetts is primarily still fossil fuels. So you can say, I don't want that gas stove, but you're plugging in your stove into a grid that's powered by natural gas.
Right, exactly. And we're importing a lot of electricity from Canada.
Absolutely, we are. And then another thing is solar, wind. I mean, they're a great source of energy, but you got to understand something. They're renewable, but the components and parts of them are not. Solar panels get broken.
That's a good point.
They get dirty. Windmills get rusty. They need to get disposed of, and they need to get maintained.
Right.
You got to mine the materials for these places. I mean, people don't seem to care if mining or all this other stuff is, as long as it's not done in your backyard, people don't seem to mind where it's done.
Sure.
But those materials, they need to be...
Where are they getting a lot of the materials for stuff like that?
Most of this stuff is, say China would be the big supplier of solar, windmills.
Yeah.
Really overseas, you get a lot of these parts because we've got another thing you have to understand, by not producing these items here because of strict environmental regulations, they're just being produced at some overseas, somewhere where the environmental regulations are not nearly as strict, where the labor laws are not as strict.
Yes.
So I think that's another thing a lot of people don't understand. They don't want strip mining done if it's in their backyard.
Right.
But they don't mind if someone overseas does some strip mining to bring the solar panel
right, of
over
course.
there, or the lithium battery.
Right, of course. It's just like the same, like I was saying earlier, if we're getting electricity from Canada or from wherever we're getting it, a lot of these places are still using fossil fuels,
and it costs
correct?
energy to bring that energy to you rather than producing it in your backyard.
And that's one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now on our electric bills is the delivery fee, which encompasses, I talked about this on my channel, but that encompasses a lot of things. But to get electricity from point A to point B, it's not cost effective, number one. And number two, there's probably, you know this being an electrician, so do I, there's probably some load drop off, right? So if you're at 100% efficiency in Canada,
voltage drop, it's
right,
physics.
It has to have some voltage drop, right? So even though we are getting the electricity here, if it's not, by the time it reaches here, it's not at full capacity, right?
Yeah.
So essentially you're paying for something that's not necessarily at 100%, right?
Yeah, exactly. And EV cars are a great example of that. Especially when it's really cold, you're plugging them in just to keep them warm, just keep the batteries warm. Imagine if you had a car with a gas tank that dripped. Drip. These electrical cars, yes, they're getting better,
yes,
but they do lose battery just sitting there.
Yeah.
Battery that's charged with a natural gas grid.
right.
And then on top of that, they're much heavier. A lot of people don't realize this too. Your Tesla is much, much, much heavier than the average sedan.
Right.
Imagine if you went cross country and you said, I'm going to put 1,000 pounds of weight on my car. Your car's fuel efficiency is going to get killed.
Right. It'll get destroyed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what you're doing by driving an electric car. And I got nothing wrong with driving an electric car. But I'm just,
Sure.
People don't realize that when you're driving an electric car, you're driving a heavier vehicle. Driving a heavier vehicle, no matter what the fuel source is, takes more energy.
Right,
That's
of
just
course.
physics.
Yep. And then in terms of, we talked about the material a little bit. So one thing that I saw happen as an electrician, especially, first of all, I will say that the LED revolution, that was revolutionary, right? In terms of
Yes.
in terms of just the electrical world, right? So that was a huge deal, right? Switching out everything to LED, so on and so forth. That was a huge savings for a lot
You're
of
talking
people.
100-watt lights becoming 9-watt lights.
Correct. It was a
Yes.
direct savings, right?
Oh,
It was a
yeah.
big deal. But one thing that both you and I know this is that some of the, let's say, newer generation LED lights and technology, you would install them in a new project, and then 5 or 6 or 7 years would go by, and then you couldn't get a replacement or replacement parts for the same thing. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yep.
Like, so for instance, they for a while there, they would make like LED recessed cans, like a 4-inch can or a 6-inch can or whatever.
Where the fixture's recessed, but the light is not.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. And, if you want to get a replacement of that specific fixture, well, that specific one is no longer available.
Yep.
Does this happen, where I'm heading with this is, do you see this, or could this happen at a larger scale, where let's say solar panels, or let's say, like a wind farm or something like that, we're buying the products overseas, we have essentially no real oversight of what they're doing. Could it come to the point where, let's say today we installed $500 billion worth of solar panels in Massachusetts, and then 10 years from now, if they need repairs or they need replacing, and that company is out of business that's making them, could that be a reality, like where you cannot get parts for these things?
Absolutely. This is what I mean by there's so much we don't know that we don't know.
Yes.
And we see this with our appliances all the time. Appliances used to last 20 years, now last a couple of years sometimes. They break, companies
Right.
new models come in place. They tell you that fixing the microboard costs the same amount as a brand new appliance.
Yes.
So that definitely could easily apply to solar panels. It could apply to EV charging stations. Those, you think it's an EV charging station, all you do is plug it in, but that could become obsolete technologically too. 10 years from now, it might look very different.
Right.
We really don't
know. And then
know.
you need some crazy adapter for your car or something like that in
Exactly.
order to even make it work, right?
Yeah. I mean, and what's unique about this industry is just, at least until recently, power distribution has not changed a whole lot for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
We had the LED revolution, but it's still the same three-phase power that Nikola Tesla used
Yes.
100 plus years ago. Still the same way we distribute power today. And it's one of these things that's been so good that I feel we're fixing something that's not really broken. That just needs a little bit of a touch up.
Yeah, I agree with you, because the reality, anytime you put all, it's the saying, you're putting your eggs in one basket, right? With the electricity and trying to generate it and be sustainable, so on and so forth. Sometimes it's better to have multiple sources, right? Because then those markets kind of compete with each other to some extent, right?
Exactly. And then the market's also going to respond to, if the market senses it's a product that can be sustainable, if investors too, you got to let investors vote with their dollars.
Right.
If they have confidence in a solar panel or if they in a certain energy technology, they're confident that it can power their building for 10, 20 years, they're more likely to invest in it.
Right.
They're also going to, and people who build buildings, developers, they also want to look like, okay, if I'm building this building, I want to get a return on investment. If this breaks, well, how much will it cost me to fix it? Or will I have to do a full replacement?
Right.
If that breaks, or what are my risks with that?
Mm-hmm.
When you're letting people vote with their dollars,
Right.
I think you get better results that way.
I think that's true. I think that is true. The other thing I wanted to ask was in terms of, let's talk about this, the strain on the electrical grid.
Yes.
And I'm just curious how much you know or don't know about this. I only know a little bit, but I was reading that with, like, let's say the revolution of AI and these data centers that are being built.
Yes.
There's a significant chance that if, let's say, the technology and let's say the draw for AI at these data centers doesn't become lower and lower, that on top of everything that's going on here within the country, that if they build more and more and more data centers, it's going to put an even bigger strain on the grid. Is that true?
Well, correct. I mean, if projections are projections, they're all subject. Trend is your friend until it ends. I mean,
Right.
that's what they would say about lights, and then we had the LED revolution.
Sure.
So we don't know what the future holds. I mean, I would hope that those can become more efficient. But yeah, it undoubtedly has increased the draw on the electrical grid, which combined with this electrification, does put a strain on the grid.
Yeah.
So,
what do you think about, like I think we had one of the plants, I can't remember if it was in Everett or exactly where it was. We had like a hydro plant or something, and we had a nuclear plant. They're all like decommissioned.
Yep,
all
exactly.
these places are decommissioned,
that's what I'm saying.
right?
Like you go back, maybe in the 70s, rather back then, it's like nuclear was the thing.
Yeah.
Or maybe years ago, they would say dams are the thing. It's renewable power, but then
Right.
some environmentalists would say, we're killing a lot of fish and a lot of mosquitoes, so we should stop building dams.
Right.
So,
The other question was, realistically, do you see this being like, going down this path? I mean, do you see a net positive out of this or no? I know I'm putting you on the spot there, but I mean, based on what's going on now, I'm not thinking like 50 years in the future or something.
It's very well intentioned. The idea is to be able to connect electrical only devices to a power grid that ideally functions on the best power possible. Mm-hmm. It's well intentioned, but it makes development much more difficult. It makes development much more expensive, and that tomorrow, that it could be many years from now.
Right.
By the time you find that energy source, it could be decades from now. We don't know.
Yeah.
That's the thing, and as you've mentioned, the technology just has not evolved to the point where we should be mandating this. I think we should I think we should really focus on making the small changes, whether it's switching from oil to gas or coal to gas.
Sure. There's a lot of people, as you know, they still have oil.
Exactly.
They don't have they don't even have propane.
They got halogen bulbs in their house.
Right.
Yes. Get some LEDs.
Yeah.
So like little changes like that are going to give you better results, and it's little change. I know that, especially when you're in politics, you want your term limited. You want to get big results. You want to leave a legacy. The idea of we're going to make small changes and it's going to look really great after 20 years, kind of like investing in the stock market. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really sell when you're running for office, when you're trying to justify your job.
Right.
But that's the more sustainable way to go.
Right. I agree. I think that it should have been smaller steps to see if something works versus imposing this on both consumers, developers, so on and so forth. And the crazy thing about it is when you really think about this, as I said earlier, like for instance, Canada, they're still producing emissions, right? They're just not happening here.
Exactly.
Right? Like you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So like if you want to change the planet, and I mean, I know it has to start somewhere. I'm mindful of that. I get it 100%. But the fact is like, we could very well be the leaders of this, and perhaps every other country decides not to do that, or they don't have the capital to do something like that. And then the United States is the only one that, of course, maybe becomes a leader in, let's say, some sort of revolutionary energy, right?
Yeah.
But the fact is, the other parts of the country, they can't catch up. They can never catch up.
If we're spending money on this, that's less money we can spend on changing our energy, revolutionizing on investments, something like that.
Right.
We're just focusing on electrifying all these buildings, putting bigger transformers, putting more strain on our grid.
Right.
That means that's money that we can invest elsewhere.
So in terms of, actually, I want to touch on one thing. In terms of the grid, so here's, to my knowledge, what I know happened. So when DPU and they passed everything in regards to shutting down plants, and we're starting to, let's say, buy energy from or outsource energy and so on and so forth. Eversource ended up having to upgrade their infrastructure.
Yes.
Within that part of your bill, that's essentially where Eversource, I believe, is making some of their profits, right? Because they're investing, and I could be wrong on this, but they're investing money in the infrastructure. They're making some of their profits on the infrastructure. A lot of their profits is asset-based, from what I understand, including the grid, right? Did they have, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, did they have to upgrade their infrastructure in order to maintain load or something like that so that they could deliver electricity efficiently?
Well, of course, you have to upgrade the infrastructure because your peak load goes up when gas is being disconnected and more is going on electricity. And I want people to understand is when they say, well, Eversource is going to pay this carbon tax and Eversource is going to pay to put our grid to the future. It doesn't mean Eversource is going to pay. It means you're going to pay.
Yes.
Because they got to get that money elsewhere.
Yes.
And they do that from raising rates, especially if they got to give rebates for other things. If they're giving rebates for heat pumps, if they're giving rebates for solar, that means whoever's not receiving rebates has to pay more.
Right.
It's simple as that.
Yeah, and that's, the crazy thing with the rebates. At least I've had a lot of people contact me in regards to Mass Save and Eversource and so on and so forth.
There's an administrative cost with these rebates too. If this one counts, this one doesn't, you got to hire a bunch of administrators. That's people that can't be hired to do other things, to research, to bring in energy policy. Exactly.
A lot of the people that are benefiting from Mass Save, you would think Mass Save was created for people that perhaps couldn't necessarily afford their electric bill, right? And they needed some assistance. But that's not necessarily who, to my knowledge, is really benefiting from this. Who is benefiting from this are people that have the money to install a heat pump.
To buy the electric car and install the heat pump.
Or buy the electric car, install the heat pump, and they're the ones that are getting the rebates back.
Exactly. While folks who are, who don't have as much income, they have to pay more for energy. And
they're getting the LED bulbs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
There you go. So, energy, you got to lower the cost of energy because it's the cost that makes all other costs go up or down.
Right.
If energy costs more, if powering a factory, if powering a classroom, if that costs more, whatever it is that you have is also going to cost more.
Right. I have one of, I'm going to go through a couple people submitted questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Scotty P asked, I was wondering if and I'm just going to read this. I'm not sure if we already covered it. There's a potential that, just a warning.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there is any on the energy engineering side that is even realistic that could help with price reduction.
If you want to reduce price, try to find a way to use fossil fuels in your project, especially with natural gas. We actually had a really good project we did up in Lowell where they had an existing boiler. And they originally wanted to electrify the whole thing, and because they had an existing boiler, they were able to grandfather in some of the heat, and we actually were able to give them almost the perfect system. It was pretty expensive to install for the initial investment, I will say that, but we put in some heat pumps, we kept the boiler, put in some new baseboard heat, and the heat pumps took care of the cooling, and you got the boiler heat that's taking care of most of the heating, and the heat pumps can still heat when it's like 40 degrees, but primarily the boiler takes care of the heat. And then you've got the cooling being done by the heat pump. So they honestly got the best of both worlds. They were able to keep natural gas for their heating, but still get the efficiency of the cooling of the heat pumps.
Just so people that are watching are familiar, because there may be people here that are watching or listening that don't know. Could you explain a little bit of what grandfathered is? Because some people may be wondering, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah. So when you grandfather something in, that's basically when a code says one thing, but you're saying, okay, I'm doing renovations. I know that if I was to put all these things up to code, I wouldn't either not be able to afford it or it wouldn't be sustainable for this building. So when someone grandfathers something in, they'll say, okay, right now we've got these EV mandates, we've got these electrical mandates, but we see you've got this boiler, and changing this boiler will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to install a new system. So they'll say, because it's existing, and since you're still making net energy improvements, that boiler can be grandfathered in.
Gotcha.
But again, it's not always guaranteed.
Right. What is it like when somebody says, because you're right, there's some certain things that I know about too in terms of grandfathering, and especially in terms of rentals, Airbnbs, and so on and so forth, if there's a resale. What would determine, why would they deny something from being grandfathered in? Just because it's so old or something like that it's something they have to do?
The unfortunate thing is it's kind of up to the discretion of the... it's up to the discretion of the building department. It's up to the discretion of the inspectors. You might get a bad inspector. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the cards you dealt with. You can appeal all these things, but then that's more cost, more time.
Right.
So sometimes
You just do what you gotta do, right?
Sometimes get unlucky with the wrong building department, the wrong inspector in the building department. Like it's
Well, you and I know both about zoning and inspectors,
Yes.
right? So what Leo's trying to say is you could have 3 different inspectors go and inspect the same project. 2 may fail it, 1 may pass it, right? It's the reality of it.
And the interesting thing about the code is I really think for people who don't know much about building codes, I compare the building code a lot to like the Constitution of the United States. There's some things that are pretty set in stone. Like you can't have more than 6 disconnects on a building. No more than like you can't have 2 senators per state. But there's so much that is actually that's up to interpretation, and different inspectors will give you different results. I mean, just look at the Supreme Court. There's these 5-9-6-3 decisions. It's really very similar in the building department. A lot of these building codes are very not clear.
Right.
What truly means, for example, electrification, or what it truly means to provide future connection for electrical. Some places it's more clear, some places it's not clear. And that's where HERS raters also come in as well. So
you work directly with them, right?
Yes.
Do you want to explain what people are, what they do essentially, the HERS raters, just so that everybody's caught up to speed?
So HERS raters basically rate how efficient a building is, whether you're talking insulation, whether it's got EV charging. Those sort of factors play in when you determine basically how energy efficient or how carbon neutral or not carbon neutral a building might be.
Yeah. Okay. One question that somebody asked here was in regards to windmills. This was Paul Bagley. He asked, I've heard windmills are bad for the environment over time. Is that true?
Well, the birds would tell you so.
yeah. I forgot about that, actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you're like me and you're an animal lover, those things are bird graveyards. But in terms of energy efficiency, I mean, they produce renewable energy. But again, they can rust out pretty easily.
How long do they normally? How long does something like that typically last?
That, I mean, I know I can't tell you the exact number, but
Sure.
I know it depends on a lot of things. The climate depends how fast the gusts of wind are. Like if the wind gusts a lot, I know just like an engine spinning.
Yeah, kind of how much load it has.
I know humidity
right?
plays a role in terms of rust, obviously as well.
Sure.
So I know there's so many environmental factors that play a role that I couldn't really give you an exact number. No,
how many windmills would we need to power Massachusetts?
A lot more. We would need. You could put acres and acres, square miles,
Really?
and they would not
thousands and thousands.
Yeah.
Same thing with solar too, or
well, first of all, if you can put tons of square miles of solar, if the sun's not shining, your net power is 0. So
Right.
keep that in mind. If it's nighttime and you need power, it's 0.
do they store them within the solar? There's a battery pack or something, right?
But think about the example we used of the car charging station. You can have batteries, but first of all, technology it's still developing in terms of their storage. And just like with the EV cars, imagine if you've got that gas tank that can drip.
Yes.
These batteries, they can't hold charge.
So now all of a sudden you need a building for these, essentially.
So much of this power gets wasted basically in storage. Yes.
Right. And then you probably have to either heat and or cool the storage facility for these batteries, right? Like it has to be well insulated to
Correct.
some point, right?
Yep. Yep.
I just can't imagine a reality where, unless it's offshore or something, but then you're still getting it from point A to point B, right?
Exactly.
So where are they going to put all these things? Like realistically, where are they going to put them all?
I don't know. You're going to have to,
I mean, you figure if they do them offshore somewhere, the fact is to get labor to go from point A to point B and get material from point A to point B, your costs have to go up substantially.
You can't power the car or the truck on a windmill, for sure.
Right. That's what I'm trying to say.
You can make it electric, sure, but it's the same idea.
All right. This guy's name is Vision GC Clips. He asked, you can answer this as best as possible. Why do politicians prioritize their green agenda over affordability of energy for their constituents?
Well, okay, that's
a big loaded question.
It goes outside engineering, but I think what I've mentioned before is politicians. Keep in mind they are usually term limited at least.
Yeah, of course.
And they have only a certain amount of time that they want to show they can make a difference. Because if you went up to the country and you said, "Oh, just like investing in a stock, I can make some good investments here, and in 20 years we'll be very wealthy, we'll have affordable energy, and things are going to look great." Well, in 20 years you might not be in office.
Yeah.
So I think it's more trying to leave a legacy, make a difference, and look, there's also money involved too. Like, you don't know who's paying for whose campaign.
Sure.
You know, there's a lot of money going around too. And I'm not saying it's corruption per se, but if you're going to get funding from wind farms, you're going to get funding from solar, you're probably going to take a closer look at the bills that
Right,
favor.
of course.
And you're probably even if you're trying to look at it from a neutral perspective, just that subconscious bias.
Right.
Well,
you have an
these people-
obligation.
Exactly. I have an obligation. These people really cared for my campaign. I have an obligation to at least take their side more seriously. It's ingrained in you mentally. Even if you're trying to stay in, I think most of us want to at least try to be unbiased.
Sure, of course.
Most of us want to try to be impartial, but all that subconscious bias can obviously play a role. But yeah, it's also, you want to make a difference. You want to sign headlines. You want to cut ribbons saying we're going to make small changes and over 10, 20 years, it's going to give us big results. That just doesn't sell as much
Sure.
when you're in politics.
I agree with that. You know what I find happening is exactly what you said, where it's like, you know, people will seem to, at least in my opinion, you know, people will seem to run with maybe not their own ideas, but somebody else's ideas. Whether they're being, you know, told from some company or somebody that donates to their campaign or something, you know, whatever it may be. And what you do is every single time that you're trying to please all of these people, it ends up diluting your message, right? Like your message becomes diluted by the powers that be and the influence that you have coming from point A to point B. And the fact is, when that message becomes diluted, I feel like people just don't make clear decisions because, again, they have this obligation to these people or this organization or this nonprofit or whatever it may be. And they feel like there's a responsibility to them because they donated to the campaign. You know what I'm saying? And then it's very hard to become unbiased and you start making decisions that aren't necessarily in everybody's best interest. You're making decisions that are both in your and the, you know, your main donor's best interest. And that's why a lot of people ask me to get into politics. Like, I don't want any part of that because it's just so easy to have people get influenced and there's just so much stuff going on. I'd rather cover it than be in it, if that makes sense.
It's more fun to cover it.
It's more fun to cover it and see how. I mean, maybe one day, but not right now, right? So I think we talked about this, diminishing returns. So somebody asked if there's diminishing returns. Obviously, there's diminishing returns if the cost to install outweighs the returns on the back end, right?
Well, yeah,
pretty
like
much.
If you spend $20,000 to install something that'll save you a few bucks a year, you might as well just put that money in a savings account. You're making a really foolish investment. And I think there's a lot of foolish investment going on with these new EV mandates.
Yes.
Just from a financial perspective, there's a lot of foolish investing going on here. I understand we want to lower our carbon emissions. I want a clean environment too. Like, I come from Colorado, which is a very environmentally conscious state. Like, they don't even put salt on the roads because they don't want to hurt the environment because of the salt. Like they will literally have people drive more dangerous conditions rather than put salt on the roads in Colorado. That's just they care so much about the environment. I'm one of these people too. I love the environment.
Yeah, of course.
And I want clean air. I want clean water. Like, I plan to have kids one day. I want them to grow up in the clean world. I don't want them to grow up in filth. I don't want, Yeah,
of course. I think we all want that.
Exactly.
But the thing is, we also can't sacrifice the citizens of today for the citizens of the future.
Exactly.
Right? Because that's effectively what's happening, right? Like, we're sacrificing... We're being sacrificed.
Are we really giving the citizens of the future any benefits, though, by giving them more expensive buildings, not letting the people who are just getting started afford a new house?
Correct.
Afford a living. If energy is so expensive, everything gets expensive.
Correct. And that's the thing. And I see it in my business, too. Obviously, I work with a lot of developers. I work with a lot of people that are just trying to get started. And the more permitting and red tape and rules and regulations...
You're just hurting the little guy.
You're just hurt... And the big guy, right?
Like, the big guy, too. The big guy's going to pass the cost to the little guy.
Correct, exactly.
The big guy producing the Eversource that has to go through all these regulations, they're going to pass the cost down to you.
Exactly.
In terms of higher utility bills.
Exactly. And that's why we see our usage side is like a third of the delivery side, which when you think about it is actually crazy, right?
That's insane.
It's insane. People were sending me electric bills and they were like $1,200, $1,400, and their usage was like maybe $450, and then the other portion of it was like $700, $800, $900, and I'm like, this is how could this be sustainable? And then you have people that are coming on here and saying, oh, well, it's the coldest time of the year, this happens every year. If this happened every single year, you wouldn't have the public talking about it so much. You wouldn't have the news stations picking it up, right? For the news to pick it up, you know something's going on.
Exactly.
Let me put it that way. And it's really wild. And on top of that, as we talked about, hurting, both, let's say the big players in the game and the smaller players, the fact is it's causing the housing market to get substantially less affordable at a time where, and I know people want to debate me on this about needing more housing. Let me just set the record straight. It's single family homes, right?
Yes.
It's single family homes that we are in a drought, right? Because they come on the market and they get scooped up instantaneously.
Well,
condos, different story.
Places like Cambridge want to completely outlaw any new single family construction.
Right. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, like, the more of these mandates and this and this and this, it's just getting so much harder. Like, imagine the stuff that you're building today, right? Let's say you're building something today and the cost is $1 million or $800,000 or $900,000. I mean, 3 or 4 years down the road, not only is it going to get more expensive to build the same unit, but if you were to sell that, it's also going to be super expensive as well because it has all this, like, flashy EV stuff, right?
Yeah, and maybe this new thing we build now, maybe they're going to find something else that they want to mandate 10 years from now that you're going to have to repair that whole thing in that building.
You're right about this, and I talk about this often. So the crazy thing, like, I always talk about looking at this from the outside in. The crazy thing about what we're talking about today and all of these mandates and all the money it's costing and potentially not saving on the back end, these were I know these were not necessarily knee-jerk decisions, but in my opinion, it is a knee-jerk decision if you don't implement things slowly. So then what happens is, if you start to look at from the outside looking in, you wonder, just like you said, what else are they going to do? Like, they did this. What else is possible?
You might spend all this money bringing your building up to code. You don't know what's going to happen next.
That's what I'm trying to say.
It makes investors really weary to bring money to our state.
Exactly. People are leaving the state as fast as they're coming in, and most of them are around our age group, right?
Yeah.
I just turned 40 years old. Like, I think the demographic is, like, I think people in the age group of like 32 to 40 or 28 to 38, they're the ones that are leaving the state.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that are perhaps starting a business or starting a company, or and they're not staying here because it's not affordable, and you're only making things less affordable. Absolutely. By applying all of this red tape. Like, it's really crazy to me. And then it trickles into other industries too. All of a sudden, plumbing may be this, right? Now they'll be trying to save water.
I know.
You'll be collecting water off your roof.
You see, right? You see that already. You see dishwashers that take 4 hours to run the dishes, and they don't even clean your dishes fully. You got to run them multiple times, and you spend more water.
Correct. It's really wild. When you really think about it, like, I know we talked about the politicians and their intentions and stuff, but, like, when you really dial it back, it's like, don't they see that this? And I always say this, like, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Like, you're trying to pay for future generations, and I understand. Like, I like nature too. I used to mountain bike all the time, and so on and so forth. And the fact is like, you're cutting somebody off by imposing what they're imposing, and it's the citizens and the people that are living in these towns today. On top of that, as you know, Massachusetts is one of the least let's say cost-effective states to live in terms of energy.
Oh yeah,
because we're at the Marcellus Shale pipeline ends in Pennsylvania, right?
Yep.
Then it wouldn't pass. Governor Healy stopped the two pipelines. It was going to go from Pennsylvania through New York to the New England region.
Yeah.
Right? That would have saved. I mean, here's the thing. I don't know what the upfront, like, I'm going to correlate these two things. So they're scared to spend the money on the upfront cost of getting the pipeline here. Right? They were scared to spend that money because I think what they were trying to say is that the investment in the pipelines is not going to equate to a lot of savings for, let's say, the people of New England.
I'd like to see if the people making these decisions are themselves actual people who develop these buildings and who make these developments, who actually do these investments.
Yeah, they can't be.
I don't think that they understand the idea of an investment.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't think so either, yeah.
Because on the same hand, while they didn't want to spend the money, on, let's say, getting the pipeline here, and they thought they were doing something that was good, for the greater good, let's call it, they're okay spending other people's money enforcing the mandates, right?
I think that they feel like they can get away with it, or feel like they are okay with it, because Massachusetts, relatively speaking, is a wealthy state compared to other states.
Yeah, of course it is.
And their constituents are going to be wealthy people.
Yeah, of course.
So they probably see that all their constituents putting in these heat pumps, putting in these electric cars. They say, yeah, I'm not sure how much this will help the environment, but, seems like the good thing to do. And
yeah, they just go for it.
And they just kind of go for it without really thinking much consequence. See, many of them even say, oh, my utility bill went up. Well, I've got a few million in net worth. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, of course.
But when you're someone who's perhaps living paycheck to paycheck, or you're perhaps someone who's just not among the wealthy of Massachusetts, and you see your energy bills go up, it makes it harder to get ahead.
I agree, and you know what I think happens too is like
issue so much.
Yeah, you know what I think happens too is like, at least for me, having kids, young kids, so on and so forth. The fact is like, yeah, there is some, obviously there's people here that have quite a bit of money. They may not care about an extra $500, $600, $700 on their utility bill, whatever it may be. But you know what happens, in my opinion, and maybe this is going a little deep, but it's like, you think about, if you think about people that have, let's say, younger kids that are just, getting out of high school or college, and they're working, and they're trying to afford an apartment and their utility bills and so on and so forth. Those Americans, even if they have the parents have quite a bit of money, like sometimes even having that quite a bit of money may not be enough to pay for, your kids' rent and their utility bills and so on and so forth. So like, yeah, you might have one class of people at a certain age group that may be okay with that and able to afford it, but perhaps their kids or their nephews and so on and so forth may not be able. You see where I'm going with this? Like,
that's the thing. You're not, and they say we're taking a temporary sacrifice for the greater good of the future. I don't see how you're doing that.
I don't see so either. There's no data to support that,
exactly.
Is there?
You're pushing away, for example, natural gas. You're pushing away a natural resource that is easily accessible here in the United States, that we can get here without shipping it on cars, without shipping it through power lines.
Right.
We can get it. It has 1/3 of the CO2 emissions of coal. These pipelines could bring tremendous amount of wealth and lower cost and energy to the state.
And we won't do it.
And we're not doing it.
It's unbelievable.
But having a bunch of trucks come by on our highways, create their emissions.
Yeah.
Polluting the way they pollute. That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. So, yeah, it's do as I say, don't do as I do, as I normally talk about.
Correct.
Right? That's essentially what it is. You brought up a good point. So in terms of, I was just thinking about, and I know you're MEP, but like, why do you think, here's one crazy question I have for you.
Yeah.
And this is something that I was going to research myself, but it's like, you look around, they're spending all this money trying to do the what they perceive to be the right thing. They have these progressive ideas, and don't get me wrong, I'm very unbiased. Like, I think that you have to have a good balance of both being conservative and also progressive, because without a mix of the two, number one, you may not get anywhere, and number one, you may not get anywhere. Number two, you may just stay in the same place, right? Like, so you have to have a good balance of the two. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it could fall too far on one side, and then it could fall too far on the other side. In my opinion, this state is a little bit too far on one side, and they really need to dial some stuff back, because what's happening is it's affecting the citizens of the state. And while, yes, there is people that are very wealthy and they may not care about these things, they're doing it for the greater good. It's one thing to be doing it for the greater good, but the fact is like, not everybody is in that same exact position. So what I want to follow up with is, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about delivery, there's so many bridges and tunnels. And I mean, you drive through the O'Neill Tunnel and it's leaking. Okay. Yep. Why, or like White Stadium is another really good example, which I cover sometimes. Why are they not investing their money into items that actually need investing in? Like the bridges, like there's the bridge in Chelsea that needs to be replaced that they're talking about.
Correct.
You know about that, right? I mean,
yeah, the one that goes up and down. Yep, and it causes makes traffic stall for
yeah,
hours.
they need to replace that bridge.
They need to, yeah.
They want to replace it. But like, why have they not? Why did they let them get so far?
Simple solutions like that, they don't seem to be concerned about that. That doesn't make saying I'm going to change out this old rusty bridge so that way traffic can flow efficiently in this one area. Maybe it might get you a few votes in the local election, but it just doesn't sell, I feel, on TV.
I gotcha. So you think it's like the optics of it? Like,
I feel like there's the optics too. Like I feel, again, the little small projects like that, while it might make locals happy, I feel like if you want to get, like you said, get the optics on you, get the cameras on you, get the sound bites.
Yeah.
I feel that doesn't, saying we're going to fix the Chelsea Bridge, saying we're going to fix our tunnels and rebuild our infrastructure. That sounds great. But when you go out on public television, you say, we're going to be the first state that does all electric, and you bring all that noise, it definitely gets more of the attention on you. And I think it makes you feel better as a politician. It makes you feel like you're making a bigger difference too. And the shorter tenure that you may or may not have.
Yeah, because essentially, if you proceed with, let's say be proactive in terms of, your bridges and roads and tunnels and so on and so forth, who would really appreciate that is obviously the people that are using them, or the neighbor, or the neighbor. Yeah. That's who would appreciate it. But they're essentially trying to put all their eggs in one basket here, and they're trying to do something, let's say, for better or for worse, that's like revolutionary. You know what this reminds me of? So one funny thing being in real estate, and I know you probably have seen this happen. So sometimes I'll go into a property and the entire kitchen, they'll have $150,000 kitchen. Okay. But then when you walk outside and you walk a little bit ways away, they need a new roof, right? So like here they are putting 150 grand or 100 grand into a kitchen and a bathroom, yet their siding is falling off and they need a new roof within the next 3 years.
Exactly.
It's probably that same mentality where it's like, okay, well, none of our friends, none of our neighbors or colleagues that come over are really going to care about a new roof.
Right.
But what they are going to care about is having a really nice area to sit and eat, or a really nice kitchen to sit and talk at. And I guess it's just human nature to some extent, right? It's just like
when the governor from the state next door visits, he's not going to be crossing the Chelsea Bridge.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's really, really like it just is what it is, Right. But I think that people should really, look at it this way, right? So in regards to White Stadium, that's a shame. They let that whole area just become, dilapidated. And it's to the point now where, yes, it can be repaired, and it can be repaired for a fraction of the cost. But you really start to think about it and dial it back. And it's like, well, you don't have to build a brand new thing. They didn't have to do that. They could have incrementally put money into the place to update it. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And they didn't do that. So it's just like, again, when you think about it, why would if Massachusetts has the money, like we've talked about, if they have the resources to do it, why not utilize some of those resources before letting it get to the point where it either needs to be torn down and rebuilt or something else put there? Because, again, you could see what's happening at White Stadium.
Fix the infrastructure that's in place before you start building new infrastructure.
Exactly.
That's all you have.
It's going to be more cost.
Seems like a common sense solution.
It would be a common sense solution, and it would be more cost effective solution. And it really, when you think about it, if they let, I did a video on that Papa's rehabilitation center, and like they're thinking about eliminating that building. At least I have to do a little bit of research on there. But the fact is like you think to yourself, how come they didn't put any incremental amounts of money to get this place up to snuff, right? Like, it makes you think, like, all of these projects that are just left sitting there, is it deliberate? Like, why, it can't always be about the optics. Like, and I'm not trying to say it's like corruption or whatever it is. I'm just saying it's strange to see happen on in multiple cases, right?
Yeah, and then you see inspectors when they're going through projects, they'll make sure that you've got all the EV stuff. But like you say, if the roof is leaking, if there's other bigger issues, if certain things are not up to code. Some of these inspectors, they're hired fresh out of college.
Sure.
They only know these EV. They don't know what's, for many years, made buildings great, why the codes are the way they are,
sure,
why some of the older stuff is the way it is. They just say, oh, okay, well, this doesn't meet the green codes, this doesn't meet that code. They miss a lot of the other things.
Yeah.
We see it all the time. Inspectors, they are literally openly hiring inspectors out of college. It's insane.
The same thing with my business. I mean, I know that the inspectors and stuff, that's another field where they're always looking for people because the turnover rate is huge. Another one is appraisers. Like, the education to get involved and the man hours that you have to put in to get your appraisal license is crazy. And they're just not letting anybody get in. And sometimes those barriers are good, but also sometimes those barriers could be bad as well, right? Because there could be somebody that's, super smart smart, they're with it, they know what's going on, and all of a sudden you have these crazy limitations for this person to get from point A to point B and start their career, and they never do it, right? They never do it because of the limitations that they put on them.
And this goes back to what we talked about earlier, the barrier of not having something.
Correct.
When you create all these rules, when you create all these regulations, certain stuff will not be invented, certain positions will not be filled, certain investments will not be made if you put such a big barrier up.
Right.
You don't realize all the good stuff that we could be missing out on because people had to invest in all these electric stoves and these expensive transformer volts.
Yeah.
That investment money could have gone so many other places.
100%. You know, it's funny, you talked about appliances earlier, and I was just thinking, you know, sometimes when I go to, I go to a house or whatever, and you know those old refrigerators, the one with like the handle, the silver handle that they have the motors on top?
That's heat pump technology, by the way, for those listening.
Oh, is it? Yeah,
it is, yeah. Heat pump
those things are still running. They're still running in the basement. The refrigerators probably weigh 300 pounds, right? But they're still working, which is crazy because you get something new. Actually, as a matter of fact, the board on the PCB board on my range actually swelled, right? Because something, a capacitor or something swelled and it bubbled out and I had to have the whole thing replaced. Thing's like 4 years old.
I know.
It's crazy. Nothing is efficient.
And then you have to, exactly. And then you have to dispose of it. You have to mine the metal, mine the plastics. You have to ship it all. You have there's all the CO2 emissions from putting all that in place.
Right.
And you have to dispose of it too. Like I mentioned these windmills too. These things have to go somewhere.
Yeah, where do they put these windmills?
You got to bury them. That's
really?
Yeah,
they get buried in a landfill.
You can't just throw them in a regular landfill. No, there's just like disposing like oil from a car. Like there's certain things that you can't just throw out. You have to dispose.
Is there a specific? Does every single state, probably not, right? Like every single state doesn't have a facility for stuff like that, right?
I don't know. Maybe it's a business opportunity for anyone else.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, you could. There's no recycling plant that can melt down a wind turbine. So.
Oh, really?
Not that I know of. I mean, maybe if someone wants to invest in a business that does that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Business idea.
There we go. So. Yeah, that's not. Is there? Well, speaking of which, is there any kind of advancements in your field that you like? I'm assuming you may go to trade shows or something like that, right? Like, what do you think the next LED light bulb is going to be?
It's really cool. We're actually seeing it in place now. It's when we can see the LED light bulbs that literally can change color. And I mean, they've been around for a few years, but I mean, they've been mostly on the expensive side. But what's really cool about what's happening with LEDs, we've talked about energy efficiency and cost savings. That's important too. But health is another big thing. Health, circadian rhythm. Light, natural light during the day is more of a warm color, and it's more of a cool color in the middle of the day. In the evening or in the morning, you get more of a warm color. That's why they say try to put your phone away at night so you sleep better. Right. Try to avoid the blue light, or at least put a night light screen or something on it. Yeah, we really see that technology with LEDs, where they're now able to, in more sophisticated designs, change color as the day
automatically.
Goes on. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Color changing LED bulbs. I think that's really I would say that's definitely the next phase of LED lights. And then they're controlled, instead of just with the light switch, you get them controlled from just a micro keypad, a station that can control all those LED lights. And again, this technology is still really expensive. It's still really new, but it's something we can really easily see in our homes. That's going to be really good for the environment. It's going to be good for cost savings. It's going to also be good for our health. I come from a background also of some personal training. Yeah. And health is a big thing, and sleep is a big thing. And, having all these blue lights when you're sick,
I've read about that before. I almost bought a lamp, because they say you should go outside in the morning and get some sunlight in your eyes, so on and so forth. I almost bought a lamp that does that. Does that really work? Does that help you become more alert and stuff like that?
It definitely helps you maintain your circadian rhythm. I mean, anyone who works a late night shift, for example, will tell you that it's really hard to be a super healthy person when you're not in the normal circadian rhythm. And when your body is seeing these bright lights in the middle of the night, it does confuse it and does make sleep harder. I mean, this goes into a second field I was once in, which is personal training and health, which I can talk about that on a completely different podcast.
Yeah. No, I was just well, let's ask you this. So beside LEDs, is there anything new on the horizon that you see? It doesn't have to be a breakthrough, but do you see anything happening in your field, or just, maybe not even on the commercial side, but the residential side? Anything at all?
It's tricky because, as I've said before, the system that was invented 120 years ago was so darn good. Yeah. While the technology's advanced, this one's been for the most part, pretty steady. But no, we've seen heat pumps used for cooling. Like I say, we're able to cool our homes for a lot less cost. We're able to light our homes for a lot less costs. In terms of like, water heaters and things like that, I mean, efficiency wise, they've gotten better, but it's nothing.
What's your opinion on demand?
On-demand water heaters.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another rabbit hole. So if you want on-demand water heater, you can forget about an all-electric building, because an electric on-demand water heater for a standard unit will take more power than the entire unit put together.
Seriously?
Yes. So if you've got about 100, let's say 125 amp panel, which is your standard panel if you live in a condo. If you put an on-demand water heater that needs to serve, let's say, 2 showers, a dishwasher, and a couple sinks, that water heater is going to take about roughly 36 kW, which basically means you're going to have to double your service to 225 amps, 250 amps.
Wow.
For your space. So if you want to use electric water heat, it's basically impossible.
Wow, I didn't know that.
That's we get that surprise all the time when they say, "Oh, I want to use it."
So what do they install in these buildings then? Just your typical electric?
You're going to need a tank water heater. You're going to need a heat pump water heater, or you're going to need a common water heater. That's another one we've done a little bit with to navigate around the code. Is we do a common water heater for the entire building.
Yeah.
Because you don't need future electrification. Because if there's no water heater in the unit, you don't need a future connection for the electrical.
Because it's already being heated by electricity, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Which it's easier to, when you have the peak load of 12 units put together, that's lower than the combined peak load of 12 of one, if that makes sense. From a code perspective. For listeners, basically, if you can assume that not everyone's going to be showering, washing their dishes, and washing their clothes at the same time in a 12-unit building. But you have to assume that one person in one space is doing all that at the same time, if that makes sense.
Right.
From a code perspective. It's like from a code perspective, you have to make sure that you size a space that the range is on, that the microwave's on, with a certain demand factor, of course. I'm getting into the weeds. But when there's more of stuff connected, the demand factor that you have to size the space to goes down. That's why we're able to sometimes somewhat downsize the water heaters.
Right.
By going with a common water heater.
Now, the buildings themselves, though, they're a bit mainly, if you can't use water, which we know is, I mean, look at radiators, hot water baseboard, those are generally efficient, right? Because when they heat up and the water heats up all of the coils or, the actual units on the wall themselves, even after the thermostat comes up to temperature, that water still is in, those pipes are still warm. The units are still warm, so it radiates, hence the word.
And it's the good type of heat. And here's another thing we haven't talked about yet. What kind of heat? Not all heat is created equally.
That's where I'm heading.
Yeah. So when you've got the traditional heat, whether it's gas heat, furnace heat, baseboard heat, it's steam heat, it's natural gas heat, it's combustion reaction, it generates moisture in the air.
Yeah.
When you've got electric heat, duct heaters, electric baseboard heaters, it basically turns your home into a little toaster.
Right.
It dries the air, dry your skin, bloody noses. We designed preschools that the teachers are complaining that we got this all electric system. The kids are getting bloody noses. The kids
really?
Yes. Well, because it's a very dry heat. And look, coming from Colorado, a lot of people from places like Colorado and Arizona will say, oh, it's not that bad. It's a dry heat. I personally never liked it. I will take the mosquitoes here and the humid summers here any day over the dry heat of Colorado. It feels like your skin is literally the life out of your skin is being sucked out. You have to drink water and drink water and drink water in a Colorado summer. Oh, yeah.
So the systems that are being installed here, is it mainly forced hot air? Is that what it is? Like, is it forced hot air, like blown in forced hot air?
Well, yeah. So you would have you would have either a ducted or ductless system, either the ducted system through your ducts or a ductless system where the units are just recirculating air, but you still have to have some kind of fresh air intake. So you would put what is called an air handling unit or an ERV, which would circulate the air and provide you with your fresh air.
Right. Yes. And so, but you all of those have to be run for at least for heating purposes off the heat pump that's outside.
Correct, yeah.
Yes. Now, what happens if it's raining or snowing and there's snow all over the condenser? Like, is it still going to operate?
Well, I mean, the code requires you to give them at least, I think, an 18-inch pedestal for the condensers for snow and things like that.
But what about on the top, right?
I mean...
the snow passes through them, right? There's the grates and everything, right?
And then they pile up. I mean, they've been...
That's what I'm saying.
They've supposedly been tested. I mean, they are all UL listed. They are all tested by UL, CTL, or at least when we specify them, or some other kind of safety tester that will test them and make sure that they're good for outdoor use, especially in such a climate.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure they're
Yeah.
good. Like, Colorado, like you start going further west, I'm sure it's fine. It's just here. It's if the winters are brutal, it's going to make it harder. And then, you know what? Because we have, unfortunately, forced out air. You know what the other thing is beside the dryness is the dust. The
Yes.
dust is crazy
It is.
in those units because, as he said, the air handler, what it does is it's it's pulling air, recirculating that air. So if you're live in a dusty apartment,
Yep.
you're effectively
picking up that dust.
You're picking up the dust. It's going through the system and just spitting it right back out, right?
Yes.
Like that's essentially what happens.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, like
I got 3 cats, and it's
the dust is crazy.
Dust and the fur is
It's crazy. And
yep.
there's really, like, what are you going to do? Hire a company every single time to vacuum the system out? Like,
Right.
how often should you do that, by the way? Like, do you ever do that with your system? Like, where they not just change the filter we're talking about here. I'm talking about those companies that come in with those super crazy vacuums and they, like, kind of sweep the system out.
Yeah.
Did you ever have a company do that, or do you know people that do that? Like, how often should you do it?
That's probably not the best question for me, but
That's
I would
okay.
say, it's
almost like a dryer
But
vent.
but you have to do it. But you have to do it more often now with the current systems the way they are now, undoubtedly. And
Yeah.
you see when you change your filter, I mean, the filters definitely get dirtier, and I'm used to them getting dirtier when you have these types of units. when
Yeah,
you
of
have
course.
them
You have to change them like two or three times a year. The
Yeah.
filters, it's
Oh, yeah.
crazy. And the thing is, with the electricity, obviously, technology pending, there may never come a time where you could use, let's say, electricity to efficiently heat water enough to heat your whole home. Correct.
Correct. And
Even if you have radiant heat, right? Like under the floors, you know how they have the PEX under the floors or whatever. It's just the cost is just too substantial, right?
correct, yeah.
Huh.
And
So like that industry would, like, let's say heating with water, right? Do you see maybe a time where that may just be completely eliminated in the United States?
well, like I said, if you have gas, if you can
use gas,
if you can
obviously.
use gas, it still works. It's hard to say because if you
I didn't even think about this,
if you
by the
don't
way.
if you don't use gas, you're talking about a dry heat.
Yeah.
And is that really the way to go to eliminate that? And for the reasons I've mentioned, I don't think it is. I think we want to. I don't.
Yeah, people should have options.
People should
right?
have options, or maybe some kind of humidity control or something or other.
You know what the other thing too is, one thing that we didn't talk about is the HVAC units. Like back in the day, right? I'm 40, so my first house had an oil boiler with a gun on it
yeah.
and so on and so forth. You know, back in the day, those things lasted forever, and you could replace components on them relatively easy, whether it be
And anybody could come in and replace them.
Correct.
Like, you have the right to fix it.
Yes.
And it's not so complicated that you have to send it back to the factory.
Right,
With all
if a
these
circulator
microelectronics.
valve broke or the gun stopped firing or, something with the motor happened, you could get replacement parts for those things. Even older units that are like 30, 40 years old, they make stuff to like retrofit. But now you could have an HVAC unit, and after 5 years, what are they, celluloids? There's something in the outside on the condenser that I had fail on one. Solenoids? Yeah,
Yes.
like the solenoids failed. And then
Solenoids,
then you got to open it up, you got to change the cell. Like there's
Yeah.
just, you could replace it, but there's some parts that are really hard to replace, right? Like, what is it called? Like the cooling coil or something? Like I've seen those on the inside. Isn't there some sort of coil or?
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're talking about. I mean, I'm not an expert in changing out
that's
HVAC
okay.
units, but
Yeah.
but I do
And it's
know
more
from
expensive.
feedback from contractors that that the parts are so intricate and so complex and so hard to get even sometimes, especially with supply chain issues, especially with model numbers constantly changing.
Correct.
And they're made that way for a reason, so that you buy the next model. If it's hard to fix something.
Right, which is crazy. So like what's happening is
And they're forced to do that because, like, maybe as the EV mandates change, as the requirements for what does and doesn't get a rebate changes, maybe they'll say, okay, well, it's not our fault that you can't fix it. We had to move on to the next model because this model they're no longer giving us a tax credit for.
Right, exactly. It's a huge scam.
Exactly.
It's crazy.
If you want to go down that rabbit hole, that's what we see, and then they can pass along and say, "Oh, it's not us."
Yeah,
It's them. They don't like the old units, so now we have to keep innovating new ones.
So I was looking at, I can't remember what the agreement is called. So my viewers may have seen this post, but in terms of Mass Save, there is, let's call them preferred partners, right?
Yep.
That are the installers. And their installment agreement that they have to sign to be a certified installer, one of the line items on it says that they cannot talk to the media about this like contract or just in general.
It's crazy how far it goes. I know.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, it's no different than if you've got a drug that's coming to market that's maybe new to market. Physicians will say like, okay, if you want to prescribe this drug, you have to promise that you won't.
Yeah, talk to the media.
Talk to the media about it. Yeah, it's the same thing here. Like, I think we've talked about the people who are making these laws. They're not engineers. They're not contractors. They're not. But they're not. Most of them are not investors.
Sure.
And when the people who are contractors, who are the installers, who actually see that what works in field isn't what works in theory.
Yes,
they're going to see these things, and they need to give them some reassurance that they're not going to stir up chaos.
Yeah, yeah,
that kind of an issue.
Yeah, it always looks better on these things. Always look better on paper than in practice.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. It's so much, and I get heat from that too. And one thing that makes me different from most engineers is I take a lot of feedback from contractors, and I'm humble enough to know that like I don't know everything, just like they don't know everything.
Yeah, of course, same here.
I'm always constantly taking feedback from them, like how expensive things are, what might be a better solution. Versus growing up, we'd hear a lot of times where contractors and engineers would fight, like each would basically show who's the smarter one who can do it right.
Now you got to collaborate.
I believe in collaborating, being open-minded about that kind of stuff. So
you have to.
Yeah.
You have to collaborate because
you have to admit that you're wrong sometimes too. You have to admit that there's a cheaper solution.
100%.
And yeah, contractor might not have the PE, might not have the degree, might have come up with it. I'm all open to learn that kind of thing. That's how we get better.
You know what I forgot to mention too in terms of solar? I meant to mention this earlier. So in terms of selling real estate, if I have, again, clients that won't even look at a house that has solar, right? They won't unless it's paid off.
Yep.
Because what happens is with solar is if you're a homeowner and you're getting solar, and no offense to the solar salesman, I got hit up by after I made that video on Eversource. So somebody was calling me at 9:30 at night trying to pitch like some crazy thing where I could get a referral or whatever. I'm like, this is crazy. But anyway, so with the solar, what happens is if you either let's say you buy them and you finance them outright, or you lease them. Okay, what happens is, let's say it costs $40,000 for the solar panels on your single family home. Yeah. All right, $35,000, $40,000, whatever it may be. The fact is, if your home is an $800,000 home and you have somebody that's looking at that $800,000 home and they're pre-approved up to $825,000, and you have a $40,000 lease agreement with the solar company, now they're knocked out of being able to purchase your house.
Correct.
Because you have to not necessarily assume their lease, but you do have to take it over, get a credit check, so on and so forth. And it's like one of those things that, and everyone is different. Every solar company, the way that they do it's different, and the way that the buyer has to apply is different, all this stuff.
It's crazy. It's like it's your own home, but it's a part of it you don't even own.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, so based on some of the data that I've looked at, like there is some savings involved, but it's really, but between the cost of the install, your payment plan, which increases or can increase incrementally every year or every other year. I don't know how some companies do it. And there is savings involved, but like most people that install them, most people only live in especially their first house for 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Your solar system is not going to be paid normally unless you're paying more on the, let's say, more towards the principal than the interest or whatever. But now they have this, like, it's like having a tail, you know what I mean? Like, and now we have to, not only am I selling the house, now I also have to sell the solar panels as well.
Exactly.
And it just makes it substantially difficult to sell a house.
Even if it's a house, like an HOA payment that comes with the house that you got to find a way to get rid of.
Exactly. And most of the time the payments are like $300,
yeah,
$350.
It's literally an HOA payment.
Yeah, it's what it is.
Even though you're in a single family.
It's an HOA payment. And the savings, statistically there is savings involved, but like, I'd have to look at charts or research to see, like, if you have to have a replace, what the replacement agreement's like. Do you have to pay for the replacement? How long they last? So on and so, or like, let's say environmentally, like, let's say a force of nature happens and a tree falls on it. Yep. Are you responsible for it?
What about cleaning them? Yeah.
What about cleaning them too?
Maintain them. You got to pay people good money to go on the roof and clean those things.
Do they need to be clean? Do they need to be clean?
Of course they do.
Yeah, I don't think anybody cleans them, dude.
Yeah.
I swear I've never seen somebody clean a solar panel.
There's a certain way you're supposed to clean them. Again, and
Really?
that's not my area of that's not my area. It's just how it's actually
But somebody's
done.
up there with some Windex and paper towel or what?
For simplicity, we could say yeah.
Yeah.
It really complicated, and maybe it's a different chemical, and different. I'm sure more efficient machine, but if dirt and grime accumulate on
Sure.
them, they're not going to be able to take in as much of the energy. So
That's true.
Just like anything, you got to maintain them.
Is there anything else? So we've been about let's see, we're at an hour and a half. Is there anything else? Do we cover everything, you think? Is there anything else we need to talk about?
I don't know. I mean, I feel if there's one thing, I think looking at it from a positive side, if there's one thing I've noticed that Mass has that New York doesn't, it's a neighbor to the north that I feel keeps us honest when it comes to a balance between conservative and progressive. And that's the live free or die state in New Hampshire. I feel when I moved to Mass, I know that it's got the nickname Massachusetts and all these other things. It's not as bad as some other places. It's not as bad as Illinois. It's not as bad as New York. It's not as bad as New Jersey.
Yeah.
If you live in New York City, where are you going to move? Like Connecticut you got Connecticut, New Jersey surrounding. You got to move miles away to move. Versus, I think these politicians deep down, they know that hypothetically, if the taxes were too high, if the energy just got too expensive, there's a state with no sales taxes just to the north of us that keeps us honest.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's one of the great things about living here in Mass and living in New England is I do feel, even though it does lean more to one side of the political spectrum, it is a state that is willing to elect a Republican governor, for example. It's a state that's willing to I feel like we are more open-minded than we think we are. And I think we really need to have honest conversations about what these energy policies are doing to us, and
I think you're right about that.
If we're really accomplishing the goals that we strove to achieve when we first launched these energy policies. Like, are we really lowering our CO2 emissions? Are we really making our air cleaner? Or are we just making energy more expensive for everybody?
Right. That's the reality. Like,
because we've been doing this for a couple of years now. Like, what's the results?
Yeah.
We should definitely audit that.
I think so. And I think it's something that definitely needs to be studied, because if you implement something and you don't actually track to see, I mean, it's just like you tracking a project or something, right? Like, if you're not maybe not constantly, but if you're not doing like a quarterly or, every 6 month or every year review to see, like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And if it's a bad thing, just own up and say, look, we made a mistake, right? Like, don't keep digging us down in the hole. Yeah. But no, you're right. I mean, I like Massachusetts too. There are a lot of, ridiculous taxes, and they're always trying to come up with creative ways to try to sneak in a tax here or there. Yep. But you're right. New Hampshire's right up north, and we have Rhode Island's really nice too. Yeah. But like, again, when you look at some of the migration statistics, there's a lot of people that work here that don't live here. Right? Correct. They live in New Hampshire.
There's been a lot of migration in New Hampshire. Yes. It's not the same state it was even 5 years ago.
No, it's totally different. Same thing with Rhode Island.
Yes.
There's a lot of people from Massachusetts that moved there just because either they couldn't afford it, they kept getting...
And if we don't keep having these conversations, it's just the trend's going to continue.
Correct. I really think people need to, at least to some extent, I think that they really need to audit exactly what you said. They need to audit this. They need to take a really good look at this. And they need to get people on board that actually... understand, right? And understand the consequences. Is this a net positive? Is this a net negative? Because the fact is, the more, and I always talk about this, the more transparent you are, even if it's a bad decision, the more transparent you are with the public, the easier it is for them to digest what's going on, right? Even if it's a bad decision that you made. If somebody said, well, we tried to do this, this is what was projected, we didn't meet those projections, so now we're going to scale back. We did the best that we could, we thought X, Y, and Z. Of course, they're going to get some criticism, but it's better than having nothing. I give
that person a lot of praise. I would say, that takes a lot of guts to do that. And
100%. 100%, but like, you can't be, spearheading
I appreciate that you at least tried to do something, even if it didn't work out. Like, because most people would do nothing.
Correct, but that's the conversations that need to happen, right? Like, if something is not working, they need to at least figure out a way to make it work, or at least present us with this is why it is working, or this is why it's not working. Exactly. And then that way, hopefully, people in Massachusetts, or just even in New England alone, they can understand why, their energy bills are so high and what they're paying for. Yeah. What are we paying for, right?
And I'd also like to see what towns like Danvers that didn't adopt the strictest of the energy codes, I'd like to see what the results in places like those were relative to Boston or to Cambridge.
There's like 17 or 18 towns here that do not rely on Eversource. They have their own independent electric. Now, there's a lot of, obviously, the majority of towns do, you know what I mean, whether it be Eversource or National Grid, however they're getting their power. But there's a lot of, I think it was, I think it may have even have been in Chelmsford, or I can't remember the town, but I closed on a condo that had their own. And it was substantially less than where I'm at, you know? So, but anyway, you want to wrap it up? Is there anything else?
No, got nothing else. It's been great being on this podcast.
Yeah, man.
And I think we had a really great conversation.
I think so too.
All right.
It was great having you, man. Appreciate it. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you.